and welcome back to my channel. Bonsoir et bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Mural, and this evening I will be doing a review for Dracula by Bram Stoker. Yes, indeed, I decided to read another OG work of, broadly speaking, speculative fiction, in this case, gothic fantasy slash horror fiction, though by modern standards this isn't exactly scary, though I can well imagine it might have been fairly frightening to contemporary readers. Most people are familiar with the concept of the vampire and the OG granddaddy vampire that is Count Dracula, but, and I'll talk about this further towards the end of the review, I've noticed that a lot of the adaptations most people have become familiar with aren't that accurate or faithful to the source material. So briefly I'll give a synopsis of the story. This starts off with Mr. Jonathan Harker going to Transylvania. Jonathan Harker is a solicitor. He's going to the castle of Count Dracula to formalize the purchase by the latter of an estate in London. Shenanigans ensue in the castle and very bad stuff happens to Mr. Harker. Count Dracula does go to England. In England live Mrs. Mina, who will become Mr. Jonathan Harker's wife, her best friend Lucy Westenra, and Lucy is being courted by 3 different men. Dr. John Seward, who is the director of an insane asylum, a Texan called Quincy Morris, and a lord called Arthur Holmeswood, Lord Godalming. And she ends up choosing the latter, but they all remain friends, and basically this group encounters Count Dracula, or at least Mrs. Lucy Westenra falls under his spell, and bad things ensue. And later in the story, we get none other than Dr. Van Helsing, and Jonathan Harker also gets involved. And so you end up having basically like a party. Imagine the classic fantasy epic party of characters, but in Dracula. And you've got the classic tropes of the vampire story, you know, the hypnotizing, the compulsion, the drinking of blood, the Christian symbolism, etc., which I will come back to shortly. Now, writing-wise, I thought it was alright. To be perfectly honest, I had a hard time getting into it at first. I thought it started off fairly slowly, and, well, to put it bluntly, the language wasn't as beautiful as it was in Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, but it was still a good level of writing. Something which complicated my experience a bit, but it also goes to the credit of the author, actually. So Dr. Van Helsing, for example, is a Dutchman, and so the way he speaks English is, flawed, which reflects the fact that he's a foreigner, so that's well done, but at the same time, when you read his chapters, and I'll get back to that, well, I mean, it's a bit clunky and tiring to read, I guess. You have the same with passages which are in the voice of Count Dracula. He's Transylvanian and he's learning English. So that meant that it took me some time to actually really get into the story. But otherwise, yeah, I have nothing special to say about it. It's not beautifully descriptive. It's standard in a way 19th century fare, which is fine, but I guess I've come across better versions of that. And style-wise, now that I did find interesting and original, so the story does have a very simple chronological linear progression. There are no flashbacks or anything like that. But it's told through diary entries, telegrams, newspaper clippings, letters, phonogram recordings, etc. So it's not quite an epistolary novel, but it's told in that format. And as such, it's a multiple point of view story because at times you have entries from Jonathan Harker's journal, you have entries from Mina Harker's journal, Lucy Westenra, Dr. Van Helsing, Dr. John Seward. So I actually enjoyed that. I found that an interesting way of telling the story, and I had no idea that's how it was originally told. Character-wise, I found the characterization also fairly decent overall. I do think you can easily identify each character's voice, especially through, well, for example, their diary entries. But overall, all of these characters kind of belong to the same type, the hero. Like, they're all good men with a strong sense of duty and courage and good Christian values and are willing to protect the women under their care. There's nothing wrong with that, mind you, but it blends together. So yeah, you can distinguish the personalities, but mostly because of their job. Dr. John Suit is a psychiatrist, and there's like a subplot in his insane asylum with a character called Renfield, who is under the influence of Count Dracula. And Dr. Van Helsing, I think he's actually the most singular character because he's this older, wizened man who has an expertise in science, medicine, law, and folklore, and he's kind of the one who saves the day because he identifies the problem correctly. And then I guess you have Jonathan Harker, who is characterized by his love and bond to his wife, Mina, but otherwise the younger men are all the same kind of character, yeah, so not great. Not bad, but not great. And with regards to the female characters, so you have Mina Harker and you have Lucy Westenra. There again, they're kind of the same type of woman. It's what I would call the ideal Victorian woman, or, the ideal of Victorian femininity. They are humble women who are there to serve their men. Like I said, the ideal of femininity period, but let's stick with Victorian. Virtuous, humble, self-effacing, caring, warm-hearted, good Christian women. Like there's even subtext about the new woman. So, I don't know, early proto-feminism that was going on when this was written. And these women don't want to be submissive. And Mina, as a character, actually plays a somewhat active part. But you can sense that, I don't know, Bram Stoker was like making a distinction. They're not these new women. They're still proper, virtuous Victorian women. So that's a bit meh to me as a more modern reader, as a feminist reader. But fine, it's alright. But it's all, of course, very pure, asexual, because in fact what symbolizes sexuality in a way in this is Count Dracula and the vampire, and that is clearly bad and evil. So, but I'll get back to that in a second. So yeah, a bit stereotypical in the image of femininity these two female characters portrayed, but that would have probably appealed to a lot of Victorian readers, I assume. And of course you have Count Dracula. So, there is a bit of backstory to him, like the whole, he was a count and he repealed advances by the Turks centuries ago and comes from a line of very noble, they're not Magyars, I can't exactly remember what ethnic group they belong to, but proud warriors with a lot of cunning and wisdom, etc. So there is a measure of respect for the character, but his vampirism is unilaterally evil, and he is unilaterally evil in a way. He's got red eyes and he's creepy and horrific and scary. So it's a very black and white way of putting forward the good guys and the villains. Again, that might feel a bit stale to a modern reader. It lacks some subtlety and nuance, even though, like I said, he does have a bit of a backstory. And there's actually, interestingly, on the part of Mina, a bit of compassion for his situation, because since it's heavily based in like a Christian understanding of things, she feels sad because, Count Dracula and other female vampires, their souls are tarnished by vampirism and they need to be liberated from that stain so they can find peace in heaven or what have you. That was interesting, but still, it's fairly simplistic overall. World building wise, I'm going to focus on the vampiric elements, right? I think Bram Stoker basically took different elements of world folklore, world mythology in a way to create the vampire you have in his novel. And it's fairly well done. And it's definitely, if nothing else, foundational, because even though it's not the actual very first vampire story ever written, most of the tropes of vampirism we have today come from there. The garlic, the religious imagery, the fact that you have to invite a vampire into your home for it to cross the threshold, the accrued powers at nighttime, the hypnotism / compulsion, all these things are present in there. Though interestingly enough, from reading the note at the end of the novel, the compulsion hypnotism isn't in itself an element of folklore. That has more to do with like the first beginnings of psychology with Charcot, who came up with the technique that we know today as hypnotism. So that's actually more something taken from contemporary science than folklore. And like I said, it's heavily, heavily steeped in Christianity, Christian language, Christian symbolism, Christian values, which is fine. That's not really my thing. Like, it's all about freeing the soul so the soul can ascend to heaven and be with God, and the evilness of the vampires is something from the devil, and so you use the cross and the holy wafer from the Holy Communion and the holy soil and church imagery, etc., etc. So this is Christian, Gothic, fantasy, whatever you want to call it. I mean, it doesn't matter, but yeah, this is definitely steeped in Christian imagery, 1000%, which also explains why it's a bit simplistic. It's good versus evil. There is, I mean, since Dr. Van Helsing is a scientist, there's a bit of that conversation going on. Science and technology, and he's trying to explain that things that modern science has forgotten or cannot grasp because it's stuck in its rigid constructs. But at the end of the day, it's about faith and virtue against evil. So it's a bit black and white. With regards to themes, I'm not gonna lie, I struggled for a little bit when I was reading the novel, and when I finished I was like, so what themes can I actually talk about here? Which it seemed weird because it's such a foundational work of literature. But I don't know, I don't think it's that deep as a story compared to something like Frankenstein or even War of the Worlds. But okay, I'm gonna go for a oldie but goodie, Sex and Death. Yeah, those two again, so Eros and Thanatos, which I talked quite a bit about in my review of The Smoke Was Up Forever by James Tiptree Jr. But in this case, it's very specific because I thought about this for a hot minute. What's interesting about vampirism is the way a vampire perpetuates its species. It's kind of a perversion, a twisted reversal of like the normal process by which life perpetuates itself. Living organisms either split in two or mate, and they live their lives and then they die to make way for new generations. But here, the vampire kills its victim in order to produce another member of its, again, species. And then those members of the new species live forever, never leave room for newer generations. So it's a complete 180 of the natural process of things, right? In any case, that was my, quickly put together analysis of it. Now, you can add different interpretations. I've never read any academic material on Dracula. I haven't done any particular kind of research on the novel or the subject of vampires, so take everything with a grain of salt, and as you should always in any case. But so my interpretation, Victorians had a weird relationship with sexuality, and I think a lot of the hang-ups we have today in the West, broadly speaking, can trace a lot of its roots back to the Victorian era, broadly speaking. And I can't really say clearly because I have no idea as to Bram Stoker's authorial intent here, but there's, on the one hand, this feminine ideal embodied by Lucy Westenra and Mina Harker. And you have the vampire that is very sensual and takes his victim into his arms and puts his mouth to their neck. So there's something slightly erotic going on. And so that to me just generally reflects Victorians' weird effed up relationship to sex. Like, on the one hand, they were very repressed, but at the same time, a lot of really kinky crap was written in the Victorian era. So that central conflict with sexuality seems in some way expressed in this. I will also add, but this is, again, 1000% my own interpretation of it, and probably influenced by the fact that at the same time as I was reading this novel, I was also reading a book about sexual violence and trauma resulting from it. What happens when the vampire drinks the blood of its victims is that they kind of fall into a fugue state. They don't really remember what happens. And you know what? To me, that actually reads as a rape scene in a weird way, like a violent rape scene where the victim experiences what is akin to disembodiment and they get disconnected from their body, which is a natural survival response. And I was like, that seems like a very similar reaction. And so you have all these men who are heroic figures. You have the vampire, who's also, by the way, a foreigner, though I don't actually think there's that much of like a xenophobic subtext, but okay, whatever. You can interpret that as you will. But so it's as if all the badness committed by not just men, but a lot of men, is kind of put onto that vampiric figure. Because, I mean, rapes were happening in the Victorian era, you know, beneath the veneer of respectability and the gentleman who had his wife and his daughters and you had to see the women of your household as these asexual angels, and so to deal with your impulses you would go see prostitutes and things like that. But that's not the reality. There have always been rapes that have happened in the household. It's not this strange creature that provokes it. So what I'm trying to say is, like, it read to me in a way as an intense projection of all that maelstrom of violence, sexuality that was repressed and ignored and silenced, which is still silenced in a way today, but I mean, okay, take it back to the 19th century. And projected onto this figure of the vampire who seduces his female victims, drinks their blood in an incredibly sensual way, and puts them under a spell where they don't really remember what happens and they're hypnotized. And it reads like a rape. It's like a sublimation of rape in a weird way. And another theme, but okay, I read about it in this very small essay at the end of the novel, and I guess I saw some signs of it in the story proper. But again, there's a bit of a discussion about superstition, tradition, folklore, supernatural crap versus modernity, technology, science. There are a few things mentioned in the book, like there's, well, hypnotism in a medical sense, Kodaks are mentioned, telegrams, newer technology, the steamboat, etc. Whereas Count Dracula with his vampires represents this old world superstition with creepy, spooky stuff. And Dr. Van Helsing has a line in there where he says, science today ignores at its peril this older folk knowledge and folk wisdom. But I thought it was very mild. I will say this, though, I think this was like a seed for others to pick up later on. And I found this quite a bit in H.P. Lovecraft's writing. You can find that just a teensy bit, I guess, in The King in Yellow, also in The Great God Pan by Arthur C. Machen. Like, that's definitely in those authors' works, and they carried it a lot further. But sure, you can find it at a seedling level in Dracula, but I don't think it's nearly as prominent as was suggested by the essay at the end of the novel. So, all in all, I enjoyed reading Dracula. It wasn't a favorite. I didn't like it quite as much as Frankenstein by Mary Shelley or War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. So to me, it sits more at a 6 out of 10 rather than a 7 out of 10. Once I got into the story, I enjoyed going through it because, like, the original Dracula story is fairly different from anything I've actually seen in any of the numerous adaptations that have sprung up since the publication of Dracula. So that was neat. And I did like I said, the format of discovering the story through diary entries and telegrams and newspaper clippings, etc. It was interesting to compare the elements of the story to the different adaptations I've seen, or the variations on the theme of vampirism. I've seen all the seasons of Vampire Diaries, the originals. I've seen all of True Blood. I have seen the movie Interview with a Vampire. I've read Mortal Instruments, which features vampire characters. I've also watched season 5 of American Horror Story, which features marvelous Lady Gaga as a vampire. I've seen also, I can't remember the name of it, but David Bowie made a movie where he's technically a vampire also. I've seen the beginning of the second version of Nosferatu. So yeah, I've seen a fair bit of material concerning vampires. And I will say this, Lady Gaga's vampire and David Bowie's vampire both share the fact that they aren't burnt by sunlight. That's a very, very big difference between the original Dracula and a lot of the variations that have followed in TV, film, and book form. Vampires don't burn in the sunlight here. Count Dracula is weaker during the day, but he can still kind of just walk around in human form. It's just that at nighttime, he can summon mists, transform into a big-ass bat, or a dog, or I guess rat probably. So his powers are greater at night, but he can just, have a stroll during the day. And yeah, in American Horror Story Season 5 Hotel, well, Lady Gaga says that she can go out during the day. It's just weaker during the day. So that was actually more faithful. They certainly don't sparkle during the day as they do in Twilight. I also read the Twilight series back in the day. It's interesting to see how popular it has become. And even this supposedly original erotic element, I feel, has been furthered even more and, pushed even more in later adaptations or variations on the theme of vampirism. It is definitely present in the original by Bram Stoker, but since it was the Victorian era, later authors and creators and filmmakers, etc., could have more fun with it, I feel. But that's definitely a cool part of the vampire figure, right? It's this mixture between sex and death. But so yeah, it was fun, a good read for October, definitely, and I'm happy I read it. It's another classic under my belt, if nothing else. So that concludes my review of Dracula by Bram Stoker. Have any of you read it? Did you enjoy it or not? Please share your thoughts in the comments down below. I have also noticed that I've officially reached 100 subscribers, so thank you very much. I hope you'll continue to enjoy my content. In the meantime, however, I hope you're doing well, that the year isn't treating you too badly, and I hope you have a lovely day, evening, whichever, and I shall see you in the next video. Bye-bye.